Hello, me again. I hope you're having a great day. It is Matsimus, and thank you for joining me on today's video. So, when it comes to tanks, the concept of firepower versus the armoured race is as old as the vehicles themselves. But it's not quite as simple as using the biggest gun, really, is it? I mean, the chassis can carry multiple different types of gun platforms, but what is the gun that really suits tanks best? There are multiple elements of this type of question, and over the past 100 years of armoured warfare, tank designers have been asking the same question over and over. Does the tank really need that big of a gun, or bigger of a gun, when they're upgrading or starting a new design? Before we can answer it, a number of things really have to be considered. Let's start off then with battle need. Does the tank really need a bigger gun? Upgrading a gun compared to existing standard leads to a lot of secondary problems after all. For one, you don't only need the new gun, you also need all the ammunition for it, and this is one of the key factors and contributing problems when it comes to upgrading tank guns. If the new gun uses existing older ammunition, the performance increase will naturally be quite small. New ammunition, however, needs to be both developed and actually produced. It is worth setting up the whole process if your enemy is using armoured vehicles, even if your older gun can't really defeat it with a relative ease. Ergonomics are one of the biggest contributing factors as mentioned when it comes to bigger ammunition other than supply of the gun and logistics. Fitting a bigger gun into the same turret obviously reduces the space left for crew, and it's already extremely tight in main battle tanks. This can naturally be solved by increasing the turret size as well, but that takes the entire process so much more complicated in order of its magnitude. While a bigger gun can, in many cases, be put in an older turret, such a thing can drastically reduce the comfort of the crew, making the vehicle harder to operate and the crew easily fatigued, which is one thing you really have to consider when operating tanks, is only as good as its crew. There's no point putting this huge gun on it if the crew can't operate it correctly. A good example of this effect would be the Sherman Firefly with its 76.2mm 17-pounder gun, with an obvious upgrade compared to the old mid-velocity 75mm of the standard Sherman. But the tankers in Normandy rarely encountered German tanks heavy enough to warrant such a performance increase. On the downside, the vehicle was difficult and exhausting to operate because the Firefly turret was not made for such a big gun, and became incredibly cramped inside. Whether the morale boost from having a Tiger killer around, which was very few when Tigers were actually used on the Western Front, was worth the hassle is a question historians still argue to this day. Secondary gun characteristics also take a huge part in this. This is partially tied to the ergonomics part which I just discussed. Simply put, gun characteristics consist of more elements than just its ballistics. To destroy a target, you have to hit it first. To hit it, the gun needs to be aimed at it. More powerful guns often carry larger breaches and have longer recoil. This in many cases really reduces the gun's elevation and depression in the chassis, since part of the gun that's behind the trunnions that are inside the turret simply bumps into the turret roof at some point. Gun depression is often a major problem for tanks with low turrets such as Soviet ones. Rate of fire is also really important too. Inside a cramped turret, a large gun can be very difficult to reload by hand due to its shell size and weight. At the caliber of 122mm, you run into the human body performance threshold. The shells start to become so heavy to load, especially inside the turret, leading to sharp drops in rate of fire, increased loader fatigue. Shells larger than 122mm typically have to be loaded mechanically, that we see in similar guns to Russia, by an automatic loading mechanism. This is a problem on its own, with the mechanisms that be quite complex, and if they break they do have problems reloading and getting the tank gun back up and running. Another issue is that by removing one crew member or the loader, you have 1/4 of the crew that is now not there, which comes in handy 99% of the time when not spent in actual fighting, but rather maintenance and other tasks that soldiers have to do in war. And I have done a video on auto loaders versus manual loaders, feel free to go check that out on my channel. But let's put that all into a practical example. It's the mid-1980s and NATO is considering what to do with the upcoming generation of Soviet main battle tanks that was expected to be generally impervious to NATO shells. The Americans launched several programs to upgrade the Abrams tank fire from the upgraded 120mm smoothbore to the massive and powerful 140mm cannon. On the Soviet side, things were roughly the same. The expected advances in Western technology forced the Soviet tank designers to consider various solutions to firepower increase, including the increase of the Soviet tank gun caliber from 125mm to 152mm. They were fully aware of the issues that I previously mentioned that it may cause. The 152mm caliber is the most impossible to load manually and very bulky, or at least bulkier, loading mechanism which would have to be installed into the Soviet tanks. The gun size increase was also considerable, but despite all these downsides, the Russian produced, during the Soviet era, a number of these very interesting prototypes. The Russian tank development history of the late 1980s is still somewhat unclear, and even Russian sources contradict each other sometimes. The Russians did want to produce a next generation main battle tank, or at least to heavily upgrade the Soviet tank fleet. Several vehicles were designed and built during the initiative, including ones armed with the 152mm gun. The first Soviet 152 tank gun project was called Object 292. It was basically a modified T-80BV rearmed with a 152mm gun called the LP-83 by the Kirov plant in Leningrad, St. Petersburg in the 1980s. The gun was developed by the Brevnetsnik Design Bureau, and there was a lot of controversy behind this project. The T-80 platform was initially considered to be too small to carry anything bigger than a 140mm gun and had to be modified. The gun development was not smooth either. Initially it was supposed to be rifled, and developing a smoothbore was considered cheaper and technically easier, so the Soviets went with it. A single Object 292 prototype was built in the autumn of 1990. The subsequent tests have confirmed that the gun represented a major improvement of firepower compared to the standard 125mm 2A46 smoothbore series, including a 50% increase of muzzle energy. At the same time, due to its advanced construction, the gun had roughly the same recoil as the 2A46, allowing it to be installed into existing Soviet tanks. The chassis of the vehicle was stable, and the vehicle performed quite well. However, with the breakup of the Soviet Union and the major budget cuts that followed, the vehicle never made it to development and into production. Its prototype stayed abandoned for years until it was moved to the Kubinka Tank Museum and recently restored. The same fate befell another Soviet tank project called the Object 195, although its history was a bit stranger. The Object 195 represented a major departure from the previous Soviet designs, as it was armed with a different 152mm gun called the 2A83. Installed on an unmanned turret, the 2A83 gun was developed roughly at the same time as the LP83, but by a different company, the Plant No. 9 in Yekaterinburg. It was a 55 caliber long, automatically loaded smoothbore gun. Thanks to its large charge, it was possible to fire the APF SDS shells from within its velocities of up to 2,000 meters a second. Object 195 was developed, even though it had budget cuts, but it couldn't really save itself from it, and following the breakup of the Soviet Union, it never came to be. A prototype, however, was built. That was clear. But little information generally exists on this tank, which is really upsetting because it would really be interesting to know the kind of technicalities that went into this tank. The project was cancelled in 1991, only to be sort of revived around the year 2000. The second phase of development lasted until 2008, when it was cancelled again, this time for good, and unfortunately there's not really much information about it. These two are best known as the 152mm projects. There were other projects from different companies such as the Kharkov's Object 47-7 Molot, and that was supposed to be also using the LP-83 gun, but they generally ended the very same way I mentioned before, and cancellation caused by lack of finances and the Soviet collapse. Interestingly enough, Object 195 was actually part of a project that formed the foundation of the T-14 Armata development. Not directly, mind you, but some solutions were using it in the later part of development, and the Armata was pretty much shocking the world in 2015 in terms of Russian tank design. By the time the Armata was introduced to the public, a lot of speculations arose whether the tank would be armed with the 125mm gun or the 152mm one. As mentioned, the 152mm gun is, in principle, compatible with platforms that can mount a 125mm smoothbore, although its introductions carry a lot of penalties on its own, namely the price. Simply put, producing and maintaining these massive guns and ammunition is extremely expensive, and with high energy barrels, they have a lot lower lifespan than the 125mm one, for example. And in a situation where Russia faces international sanctions and its military budget is becoming quite tight, modernized 125mm guns seem a lot more rational choices. The second aspect is the actual battle need, or more specifically, the lack thereof. In short, there are no real potential targets on the battlefield that are longer than a modernized 125mm gun can't really handle. The United States are still operating with the same Abrams main battle tank, although upgrading its armor packages, but even in their modernized forms are really far from indestructible. As I've mentioned in my videos in the past, in Europe the aging but beautiful Leopard 2A5 and A6 variants are being gradually modernized, but much of the European MBT fleet consists of the older Leopard 2 variants of, let's be honest, questionable combat value when it comes to main armaments in case of, engaging thicker armor placements on modernized Soviet-era equipment. The introduction of higher tank calibers to Russian tanks would be really required if potential enemies came up with something really different, a brand new cutting-edge main battle tank, which I don't think we're going to see in the near future. With the American plans to keep upgrading the Abrams for at least another decade or two, and with plans for a future European MBT, or potentially referred to as Leopard 3, and I hate saying that, but it's a potential, is still at the stage of mere intention and, just dreaming at the moment. Money is just so tight, folks. It's just really hard to see a new main battle tank coming out nowadays. And the emergence of these threats in the near future seems really unlikely in these modern day combat tank battles. Interestingly enough, the 2A83 gun was confirmed to be considered at one point as being the main armament for the Armata platform MBT, but due to reasons that I have mentioned, it never happened and the tank was introduced to the public carrying the beautiful 125mm 2A82 smoothbore instead. Compared to the 125mm smoothbore, the 2A83 is almost twice as heavy at 2.7 tons compared to 5 tons, has roughly the same muzzle velocity of around 2000 meters a second, has a much higher muzzle energy, has roughly the same potential rate of fire using an autoloader of roughly 10 rounds per minute, and has only 1/3 of the barrel lifespan, around 300 rounds compared to the 125mm 900 or so, and that's really important because once you put 300 rounds down range, and let's put at least 150 of them as training, you've only got a gun barrel that's capable of another 150 rounds to engage if it went into combat. That's insane to me. Cutting edge rounds for the 2A83 are also in development, although whether a 152mm variant of the Armata will ever be built is a complete matter of speculation, and I see it as being quite unrealistic because of the financial problems. So folks, what do you think about a bigger, better gun like the 152mm cannons that the Russians were thinking about? Do you think it's the way we're going forward? I know that the Western world is looking at the 140mm gun, but for those tank loaders out there who are manual loaders, you must obviously know how difficult it can be just operating the 120mm rounds for a continual period. I can't imagine pumping down rounds of 140mm or even 152. That's where autoloaders have to come into place. Older Soviet equipment, 100mm, 125, you can kind of work with at least, but it's still heavy bits of kit getting shoved into a barrel, and eventually something will fail, whether it's mechanical or human. It's just really interesting to see how the Russians have tried their best to look into the research and development of bigger guns for their tanks. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed today's video, folks. Please leave me a comment. Let me know what you think of modern main battle tank armaments and whether or not you feel they should be bigger or maybe even smaller. I'd love to hear your input on it. If you want to support my channel, please go check out my Patreon account. I'd be much appreciated if you could do so. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. All the best. Bye-bye.